Picture the scene. It is the end of an era. The air is thick with the smell of burning timber, melting bronze, and just total despair.
Oh yeah, the classic apocalyptic setting.
Exactly. The impenetrable walls of a legendary city are crumbling. You can hear the screaming of citizens, the clash of weapons, the roaring flames consuming palaces that, stood for generations. A king falls.
An empire dies.
And it's incredibly cinematic.
Right. And out of this apocalyptic smoke and ruin, a survivor emerges, fleeing the destruction of Bronze Age Troy. Now, what if I told you that this exact image, the most famous, widely repeated story about the Norse god Odin escaping the fall of Troy, is entirely based on a massive, centuries-old misunderstanding of one single sentence?
It really is the ultimate historical illusion. I mean, we have been looking at a medieval text for hundreds of years, but seeing only a reflection of our own modern assumptions.
Welcome to the Vóden files.
We've basically built an entire academic consensus on a foundation of misread chronology, which is wild. So we're taking a deep dive today into a topic that is going to completely rewire how you think about Norse mythology, medieval history, and just the way we interpret ancient texts altogether. Our mission today is straightforward, but incredibly ambitious. We are going to dismantle the popular, almost universally accepted academic dismissal of Odin's Trojan origins.
It's a huge undertaking, but the brief from Project Troy investigating Odin's Trojan ancestry really lays it out perfectly.
For generations, scholars have pointed at the Prose Edda, and they have literally laughed off its claim that Odin came from Troy. Why? Because the timeline of the Bronze Age Trojan War and the migration of Germanic tribes makes absolutely zero sense.
Right. On the surface, it looks ridiculous.
But today, using this incredible brief, we are asking the one question no one else has bothered to ask. Which Troy?
Yeah, the source material we're unpacking today challenges the absolute bedrock of medieval historiography. We're going to look closely at the actual claims made in these texts rather than, the simplified summaries that have been passed down in textbooks.
Untangling this will fundamentally change our understanding of the historical Odin when he might have actually lived, and the true, deeply strategic motives of the medieval saga writers who recorded his story.
Because we have to start by clearing away that foundational myth.
Right. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the myth of Odin himself, but the modern academic myth about what the text actually says.
Yes. There is this one-sentence summary that generations of historians, scholars, and, armchair mythologists have just relied on blindly.
You see it in introductions to Norse mythology, you hear it in university lectures, and it goes exactly like this. Snorri claimed that Odin escaped from Troy after the Trojan War.
When you look at Snorri's prologue to the Prose Edda, that single sentence is how it is almost universally summarized by critics. And the moment that summary is accepted as accurate, the entire narrative is just doomed to be dismissed.
Because when you say it like that out loud, it sounds utterly ridiculous.
Completely absurd.
You have the Trojan War, which most historians and archaeologists place at the very end of the Bronze Age, right around the 12th century BC. Now, the text mentions that Caleb Howells might have some fascinating alternative views on that dating.
Which is a whole other rabbit hole.
A massive rabbit hole for another time. But generally speaking, the academic consensus places the fall of Troy in the closing period of the Bronze Age.
Right.
And then on the other side of the historical ledger, you have the migration legends of Northern Europe. Those generally sit in the early centuries AD, during the Iron Age, specifically the migration period.
Yeah, so we're talking about a gap of 12 to 1500 years.
It's chronologically impossible.
The chronological gap is insurmountable if you accept the premise. It is the historical equivalent of claiming that a survivor of the American Revolution personally commanded a tank battalion in World War II.
That's a great way to put it. It simply cannot happen.
And that glaring impossibility leads to a very obvious, very final conclusion for most scholars. They look at that millennium-wide gap and declare that Snorri's account is a complete fabrication.
Just throw the whole thing out.
Exactly. The whole Trojan origin story is filed away as a medieval invention, a fantasy designed to make Norse gods look like classical heroes. Case closed. There's nothing more to investigate.
But the brief from Project Troy points out a massive, glaring blind spot in that dismissal. And the blind spot is this. That is not what Snorri's genealogy actually says.
Not at all.
We have been summarizing a text incorrectly and then mocking the text for our own incorrect summary.
The mechanics of textual transmission, combined with our human tendency to seek neat summaries, have completely obscured the original claim here.
Yeah.
If you actually sit down and read the prologue of the Prose Edda, really read the words on the page without imposing later assumptions onto them, it absolutely does not place Odin beside King Priam at the fall of Troy.
It doesn't paint a picture of Odin dodging Greek spears, jumping on a longship, and sailing directly to Scandinavia to escape Agamemnon.
Not even close.
In the text, Odin is placed at the far, far end of a massive, sprawling list of descendants.
He is not at the beginning of the genealogy.
No. He isn't standing next to the burning gates. He is the culmination of a vast timeline. I actually want to read through the specific sequence that Project Troy highlights, because hearing the sheer scale of this timeline is crucial to understanding how drastically wrong the modern summary is.
The sequence is the key to breaking the illusion. It forces us to confront the actual distance the medieval author placed between the ancestral city and the historical figure.
Okay, so here is the lineage as the Prose Edda traces it. It starts with King Priam of Troy. From Priam, it goes to a son named Trór, then to Thor, who's also called Trór.
And that's just the start.
Right. Then we skip a few generations to Lóridi, then Einridi, Vingithor, Magi, Moda, Seskef, Bedvig, Heremod, Iterman, Athra, Jad, Skaldun, Bjaf, Gudolf, Finn, Friolaf, and finally, after all of that, we arrive at Vóden, whom we call Odin.
That is over 20 generations.
Over 20.
And if we connect this to the broader picture of medieval literature, we have to acknowledge that this genealogy is heavily composite.
Right, it's stitched together.
Exactly. It is a patchwork of different cultural traditions. It contains material clearly borrowed from Anglo-Saxon royal pedigrees. I mean, names like Bedvig, Heremod, and Finn, those are absolute staples of English king lists.
Now, we aren't suggesting for a second that this is a precise, biologically accurate family tree.
No, of course not.
You can't just take this list, assign 25 years to each generation, and use it as a mechanical calendar to date the exact year Odin was born. The integration of Anglo-Saxon names proves it was actively constructed and expanded over time.
Its biological or calendar accuracy isn't the point, and focusing on that is a complete distraction.
Right.
As the text from Project Troy emphasizes, the issue is what this genealogy was designed to communicate to its original medieval audience.
Okay, let's unpack this. What was it communicating?
Well, even if a genealogy is distorted, even if it contains borrowed ancestors or missing generations, or is a deliberate political construction designed to harmonize different royal houses, a genealogy still communicates sequence.
Sequence. That is the operative concept here.
Yes.
The text says Odin descended from the Trojan royal line. It does not say Odin personally escaped from Troy when Priam City was destroyed in the Bronze Age. Those two statements are worlds apart.
And if we really think about the intent of whoever originally compiled this specific list, the logic of the refugee theory completely falls apart.
How so?
Well, if a medieval author truly wanted to claim that Odin personally lived in Priam's Troy during the famous war, there would be absolutely no logical reason to insert 20 generations of fathers and sons between Priam and Odin.
Right. If you want to say someone fought in the Trojan War, you just describe them as a Trojan prince or a battlefield commander or a direct refugee of that era.
You don't bury them at the end of a centuries-long dynastic list.
To use a modern equivalent, it's like someone today claiming descent from the Mayflower.
Oh, perfect analogy.
If I tell you, hey, my family came over on the Mayflower, I am communicating an ancestral line. I am claiming a specific prestigious heritage that traces back to a foundational event. I am not claiming that I personally was wearing a buckle hat, standing on the deck of a 17th century galleon, getting seasick on the Atlantic Ocean in 1620.
Exactly. You're saying you are the latest inheritor of that older line.
If Snorri wanted to say Odin was at the Bronze Age War, why on earth would he construct a family tree that explicitly proves he wasn't?
The text makes a claim of descent. Odin descended from the Trojan royal line. It does not make a claim of personal experience. Odin escaped burning Troy. Those are fundamentally different claims.
But over the centuries, modern retellings have taken the nuanced dynastic claim of the text and just smashed it into the ridiculous chronological claim that historians love to debunk.
It's intellectually lazy. If we untangle this, it seems modern historians are conflating three totally separate concepts.
Yeah, we've taken distinct historical propositions and shoved them into one impossible box.
The Project Troy brief methodically separates this Trojan narrative into three distinct propositions. Modern readers have incorrectly collapsed these three propositions into one single event. If we want to understand the text, we have to pull them apart and analyze them individually.
Let's lay them out. Proposition 1 is what we've been talking about. Trojan ancestry. This simply means Odin belonged to or claimed descent from a Trojan royal or ancestral line.
Yes, that is a statement about bloodline, heritage, and political legitimacy. Proposition 2 is personal residence.
Okay.
This would mean Odin himself was born in, lived in, or ruled a physical place called Troy.
So you could live in a place called Troy without being descended from King Priam. Just like I can live in Rome today without being biologically descended from Julius Caesar.
Right. Or, conversely, you could have Trojan ancestry but never have set foot in the physical city of Troy yourself.
Exactly. And finally, Proposition 3 is Trojan War chronology. This is the claim that Odin lived specifically during Priam's reign and was personally present during the famous Bronze Age Trojan War that Homer wrote about.
Ancestry, residence, chronology. 3 distinct ideas.
Yet the moment we hear the word Troy, we immediately merge all 3.
This is the logical trap that modern historians keep falling into. The first claim, ancestry, does not automatically establish the second claim, residence.
Right.
And the second claim, residence, does not automatically establish the third claim, chronology.
This dynamic isn't unique to Norse texts either. Think about the political landscape of medieval Europe. A medieval Frankish or German king could, and often did, claim descent from Rome.
Very common.
They desperately wanted the prestige of the Roman Empire to validate their own rule. But claiming Roman descent did not mean that medieval king actually lived in the Roman Republic.
No, of course not.
It didn't mean they personally voted in the Senate alongside Cicero.
Or look at the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. A later dynasty in the Hellenistic period might strongly identify itself as Persian. They might adopt Persian court customs, wear Persian dress, and claim direct lineage from the Achaemenid kings.
Right, but claiming that identity doesn't mean the current ruler lived under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC.
Exactly. A population can preserve the identity, the name, and the cultural memory of an ancestral homeland for centuries, long after they have physically left it, or long after that homeland has changed hands.
So applying that mechanism to our text, why has Odin's claimed Trojan descent Proposition 1 been universally treated by scholars as absolute proof that the text is claiming he personally walked out of the burning Bronze Age city Proposition 3?
Because that is an interpretation imposed upon the text by modern readers. We bring our own intense cultural assumptions to the reading. We hear the word Troy, and our minds are so saturated with the classical epic tradition that we instantly jump to Homer, the wooden horse, Achilles, and the Bronze Age collapse.
We cannot imagine Troy as anything other than a singular, catastrophic moment in time.
Right. The genealogy itself does not clearly state that Odin was a Bronze Age refugee. We projected that Hollywood narrative onto it.
So what does this all mean? Think about how often we read ancient texts through the lens of our own pop culture assumptions. Snorri, or the much older oral traditions he was attempting to record, gave us a dynastic inheritance story.
A story about bloodlines, continuity, and political legitimacy over vast stretches of time.
And modern scholarship completely steamrolled it into a refugee survival story, just so they could dismiss it as chronologically absurd.
This distinction between a dynastic timeline and a refugee story becomes undeniably clear when you look at how the prologue actually structures its narrative.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah, the famous migration out of the east, the great journey that brings Odin to Scandinavia, does not happen immediately after the fall of Troy.
No, it happens after the entire genealogy concludes.
Yeah.
We get all 20-plus generations we listed earlier, ending with Vóden.
He is described as a man renowned for his wisdom, his accomplishments, his exceptional leadership.
And then, only after establishing who he is and who he descends from, the text says he prepares to leave a place called Tyrkland with a great company of people.
The geography the text utilizes here is critical. Tyrkland in Old Norse literature generally refers to the broad region east of Europe,
Right.
often overlapping with Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and the lands around the Black Sea.
It's a massive, volatile geographic theater.
From this region, Odin and his followers travel through Saxland, which loosely correlates to the Germanic territories of Central Europe, and eventually farther north into Scandinavia.
And as he goes, he establishes rulers, sets up dynasties in places like Denmark and Sweden, and introduces new laws and technologies.
The text explicitly states he brings Trojan custom and government to the new northern world.
So the actual narrative structure is Troy falls in the distant past. An ancestral dynasty survives and stretches across generations. Successive fathers and sons pass the legacy down. Then we get to Odin in Turklen. Then the migration north happens.
Compare that deliberate generational structure to the popular simplified version we discussed at the beginning. The popular version is simply Troy falls, Odin escapes the fire, Odin immediately travels north to Scandinavia.
It's like reading the cliff notes written by someone who didn't actually read the book and then critiquing the author based on the cliff
Now,
notes.
that's exactly what it is.
The actual text is a dynastic inheritance story. The simplified myth is a refugee story. And as the Project Troy brief argues, while the sources might contain echoes of both concepts, they absolutely should not be treated as identical. Doing so destroys the nuance of the historical claim.
If we accept that the Trojan connection was not originally intended to tell us when Odin lived, because inserting 20 generations clearly proves it wasn't a chronological timestamp, then we have to ask what its actual purpose was.
Right.
And the most likely answer, grounded in the realities of the ancient and medieval world, is that it was intended to tell us why his house possessed the unquestionable right to rule.
So if we completely strip away the illusion of the Bronze Age refugee, we are left with a glaring political question. Why construct this specific ancient lineage at all? You don't forge a 20-generation genealogy tying a northern god king to an Anatolian city just for fun.
No, you do it because you need leverage. We are getting into the gritty, pragmatic politics of the ancient world.
Let's run a historical thought experiment based on the socio-political realities of the migration period. Suppose the tradition of Odin is based, even loosely, on a real historical figure.
A historical ruler, a tribal founder, or perhaps a warlord leading a massive coalition of displaced peoples, operating somewhere in the wider Black Sea or Caucasus region during the Iron Age or early medieval period.
I'm picturing the environment. It's highly volatile. You have competing war bands, migrating tribes, different clans speaking different dialects, pressure from the east, pressure from the Roman or Byzantine borders.
It's a pressure cooker of shifting alliances.
In that environment, power is fragile. Now, ask yourself, why would families uproot their entire lives to follow this one specific man?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why would seasoned warriors abandon their ancestral hunting grounds, accept him as their absolute supreme leader, and march hundreds or thousands of miles into the freezing, unknown, heavily forested north?
And furthermore, when they finally arrive and settle, why would these fiercely independent Germanic tribes accept his sons as their permanent kings?
You can't just say, hey, I'm pretty good with a spear and I have a great tactical mind, follow me to the tundra. Skill in battle might win you a skirmish, but it doesn't buy you multi-generational loyalty. You need a narrative. You need unquestionable, almost divine authority.
A prestigious ancestry claim provides that supreme political leverage. It functions as the ultimate social glue. If a leader can successfully claim and convince his followers that he descends from an ancient, legendary royal people, he gains several massive advantages immediately. First, hereditary authority.
Right. He isn't just a strong man who seized power yesterday. He is destined by ancient blood to lead.
It transforms him from a warlord into a monarch. Second, it provides unity. If you have disparate clans, maybe some are Goths, some are Alans, some are early Germanic tribes, and they all begin to believe they share a distant connection to this ancient noble lineage, it binds them together under his banner.
It creates a shared identity that supersedes their immediate tribal differences.
Exactly. It creates an us against the world. A shared origin myth is incredibly powerful for a migrating people.
It really is.
Third, it grants undeniable legitimacy over rival leaders. If your rival's grandfather was just a local chieftain who owned a lot of cattle, but your ancestor was a king of Troy, you have the theological and political high ground.
Oh, definitely.
And finally, it provides a crucial sense of continuity. Uprooting your civilization and moving to a new harsh land is terrifying. It breaks the social order. But if you are carrying the legacy, the laws, the religious customs, and the identity of a famous ancient empire with you, you aren't just desperate refugees fleeing violence. You are a continuation of greatness. You are planting a new Troy in the north.
This is such a powerful way to visualize the mechanics of ancient politics. Imagine the backdrop shifting borders, constant warfare, the threat of larger empires looming. And this leader stands up and says, we are not a rabble of mercenaries. We are the surviving heirs of an ancient royal people. Our house descends from the kings of Troy.
It functions as the ultimate unifying banner.
It gives a fractured people a reason to stay together when things get tough.
We must be careful to ground this in methodology, though. As the Project Troy brief responsibly notes, we have no surviving speech transcript where a historical Odin literally says this to a crowd of warriors.
Right. It would be entirely irresponsible to present the scenario as a proven, documented historical event. We aren't doing historical fan fiction here. We are trying to deduce the function of the text.
But as a political interpretation of the genealogy, it makes perfect logical sense. It aligns completely with how ancient and medieval rulers actually behaved, how they consolidated power, and how they utilized the concept of origo gentis, the origin of the nations.
Yeah.
It suggests that Troy was not the place Odin had just physically escaped from in a panic. Troy was the ancestral claim that legitimized his kingship.
I have to push back a little on this framework, though. Is this essentially ancient political propaganda? Was Troy just a brand name Odin used to make himself a king?
That is the pivotal question that pivots this entire investigation.
Because calling it a brand name or purely cynical fabrication assumes that the original Troy was long gone. It assumes Troy was nothing but ashes, buried under dirt, surviving only in the verses of Homer. But what if Troy wasn't just a dusty memory of a Bronze Age fire? What if Troy was still very much alive and functioning as a geopolitical entity?
This brings us to the core revelation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to throw the most mind-bending question of this entire deep dive at you. When the texts say Odin's lineage came from Troy, which Troy did they mean?
This is where the archaeological evidence completely shatters the popular, simplified assumption. When modern readers hear the word Troy, they almost automatically exclusively imagine the single city destroyed in the war associated with Homer's Iliad. We picture the Bronze Age city and only the Bronze Age city.
The moment of the wooden horse, the 12th century BC.
Right. But archaeologically speaking, Troy was not a single city that existed at one moment in time, burned down once, and vanished forever into myth. The physical site of Troy, located at a hill called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey, contains successive settlements that were built, destroyed, and rebuilt across thousands of years of human history.
Thousands of years. It wasn't a blip, it was a permanent fixture on the landscape.
According to UNESCO, and over a century of extensive excavation, the site contains evidence of more than 4,000 years of continuous or near-continuous occupation.
4,000 years.
Archaeologists have labeled these different occupational layers Troy Phi through Troy Nive. And crucially for our investigation into the historical Odin, the story of the city absolutely does not end in the Bronze Age with the famous layer we associate with the Trojan War, which is usually identified as Troy VI or Troy VIII. Greek and Roman cities later occupied the exact same hill.
So the city didn't die, it evolved.
Yeah.
The location remained too strategic to abandon.
Troy continued to exist, and it was known historically as Ilion to the Greeks and Ilium to the Romans. And this wasn't just a handful of shepherds living in the ruins of Ulnar palaces. It served as a major religious, political, and commemorative center long after the Bronze Age ended. In the Roman period, it became incredibly important. Roman emperors like Augustus, Hadrian, and Caracalla visited it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they poured money into it. They built new temples, theaters, and infrastructure. Why? Because the Romans themselves claimed descent from Troy through Aeneas.
Right, the Aeneid.
Exactly. They viewed Ilium as their own ancestral mother city. They granted it tax exemptions and special political status.
Let that sink in. So what you're saying is the word Troy cannot automatically function as a Bronze Age timestamp. The assumption that Troy equals 1200 BC is historically illiterate.
If someone in the ancient or early medieval world said, "My family is from Troy," they were not necessarily talking about the Bronze Age. A person could have lived in Troy during the Hellenistic period without living during the Trojan War. A prominent family could have left the region of the Trór during the Roman era, migrating north or east due to political shifts or trade. A local dynasty could claim Trojan identity hundreds of years after King Priam was dead, and that identity would be recognized by surrounding empires.
Let me try to frame this with an analogy, because this completely changes how we read the ancient sources. Assuming anyone in a medieval text who says they are from Troy must be from the Bronze Age, it's like assuming anyone today who says they are from London must have personally known Julius Caesar when the Romans founded Londinium.
It is the exact same logical fallacy.
Cities evolve. They have strata of history. If I meet a guy at a coffee shop and he says, "I just moved here from London," I don't assume he's a 2,000-year-old Roman legionary complaining about the weather in Britannia.
No, you'd think he's from modern London.
Exactly. But we look at Snorri's text, we see the word Troy, and we immediately force it back to 1200 BC, and then we call the medieval author an idiot because the timeline doesn't match the migration period.
We created the paradox by ignoring the archaeology of the city, not the text. The Project Troy brief is very careful here, and we must maintain that rigor. This archaeological reality does not mean that the Prose Edda is secretly, explicitly referring to Roman Ilium.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
We don't have definitive proof of that specific intention. What it means is that a group could preserve a tradition of descent from the inhabitants of Troy, or the wider Trór region, without any of its current members ever having seen the Bronze Age city or having any connection to the Homeric War.
I see the logic, but hold on. I'm going to challenge you here.
Sure.
Modern archaeologists, with their carbon dating, deep French excavations, and satellite imagery at Hisarlik, know about Troy through IX. We have the benefit of modern science to map out Roman Ilium. But did a medieval Icelander like Snorri know this, or are we giving them too much credit?
That is exactly the right critical question, and the Project Troy document addresses this specific friction. We must absolutely distinguish what modern archaeology knows from what medieval Icelandic writers could have known or conceptualized. Snorri obviously did not know the modern archaeological sequence labeled Troy I through Troy IX.
Right, he wasn't digging trenches in Anatolia or reading excavation reports. So what did he know? Because if he thought Troy only existed in the Bronze Age, doesn't that bring us back to square one?
It creates two distinct possibilities for how the text was formed, and both of them destroy the traditional academic dismissal.
Okay, let's hear them.
Let's look at the first scenario. If the medieval writers did not know about the later ongoing history of Troy, if they thought it was just the famous Bronze Age city that burned once and vanished, then when they encountered an older, pre-existing tradition that simply stated Odin's people are of Trojan descent, they might have automatically and incorrectly attached that lineage directly to King Priam.
I see. Because Priam's Troy was the only Troy they knew about from their reading of classical literature.
Yes.
So they took a later, perhaps Roman-era migration story from the region of the Tród and accidentally backdated it to the most famous guy they knew from that area. They stretched the timeline to fit their limited geographical and historical knowledge.
That is one very strong possibility, the accidental backdating hypothesis. However, there is a second possibility. If the medieval writers did possess traditions that Troy had a later history, but they still chose to attach Odin specifically to Priam, then that was a deliberate, calculated upgrade.
Oh, I like.
They were extending his ancestry past the mundane later iterations of the city into the most prestigious possible past for maximum political effect.
Why settle for being descended from a Roman-era Trojan merchant or a minor provincial governor when we can say we descend from the great King Priam himself?
Exactly.
It's PR, it's narrative inflation.
But here is the critical takeaway that the Project Troy brief emphasizes. Whether it was an accidental backdating due to a lack of deep geographical knowledge or a deliberate upgrade for political prestige, both scenarios mean the exact same thing for modern scholars.
Which is what?
We cannot simply accept the simplified Odin escaped the Bronze Age story at face value. The timeline in the text is an artifact of textual transmission, not a literal claim of when the historical Odin lived. We have to look deeper into the geography and the older layers of the tradition.
We have to stop laughing at the timeline and start investigating the actual mechanics of how this story moved across Europe. And we actually have some concrete data on what medieval Icelanders knew about Troy and how they conceptualized its history, don't we?
We do, and it is much more extensive than people generally assume. The medieval Icelanders were not isolated in the frozen north, entirely cut off from the classical knowledge of the Mediterranean. They possessed a substantial body of Trojan literature that circulated throughout the medieval world. The brief specifically highlights a text known as the Trojumanna saga.
The Saga of the Trojan Men.
Yes. It's an Old Norse retelling of the Trojan story, surviving in several different redactions, and it drew heavily from the Latin tradition. Specifically, it relied on texts associated with Dares Phrygius.
Remind us who that is.
Now, Dares Phrygius purported to be a first-hand eyewitness account of the Trojan War from the perspective of a Trojan priest.
Ah, okay.
In the Middle Ages, Dares was wildly popular, often preferred over Homer, because Homer was seen as a Greek partisan who exaggerated the involvement of the gods, whereas Dares was viewed as a sober, historical, and crucially pro-Trojan account. The Trojumanna saga circulated in Iceland and adapted this classical Trojan history for a Norse audience.
They were basically reading the medieval equivalent of historical thrillers about Troy, translating them into their own language and cultural idioms.
But here is the crucial detail regarding our investigation into how they viewed the city itself. At least some of these Icelandic Trojan traditions knew that Troy had been destroyed and rebuilt. In their versions of the narrative, King Priam himself is actually presented as rebuilding the city after an earlier destruction by the Greek hero Hercules.
Wait, really? So the concept of a multi-layered Troy, a city that falls, is cleared away and rises again, wasn't a foreign concept to them.
Not at all. That detail proves that learned medieval Icelanders did not necessarily imagine Troy as a one-and-done city. They understood it as a physical place capable of regeneration and continued existence.
That completely changes things.
The harder question, which the Project Troy brief admits hasn't been fully resolved, is whether Snorri understood the historical continuation of Greek Ilion and Roman Ilium centuries after Priam. Did he know the city was still standing during the Roman Empire?
Even if he didn't know the specifics of Roman provincial administration, just knowing that the city could be rebuilt means they viewed it as a real geographical location on a map, not just a mythical fairy tale realm that vanished into the ether. And speaking of geography, we need to map this out for you guys, because skeptics often act like claiming Odin came from the region of Troy to the Black Sea is like claiming he commuted from the moon to Mars. They treat it as an insurmountable geographic leap.
The geography is not absurd at all. In fact, it follows the most well-established trade and migration routes in human history. The proposed eastern setting of the Odin migration tradition, Turkland, the Caucasus, the region north of the Black Sea, the Don River, is often treated by skeptics as though it belongs to a world completely disconnected from the Aegean and Troy.
Right.
Historically and geographically, that is entirely false.
Let's look at the physical map. Troy, the physical site of Hisarlik, is located right on the Dardanelles. That is a massive, incredibly strategic maritime gateway. It connects the Aegean Sea, the Sea of Marmara, the Bosporus Strait, and directly feeds into the Black Sea.
The Black Sea and the region around Troy belong to a deeply connected political, commercial, and military environment for millennia. Troy's wealth and power literally came from its location as a bridge and a toll gate.
It sat right at the intersection of land routes between Anatolia and the Balkans and maritime routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea.
The currents in the Dardanelles forced ancient ships to wait for favorable winds, often requiring them to stop at Troy, paying tolls, or trading goods.
So a population, a merchant fleet, or a migrating warband operating north of the Black Sea could absolutely reach the Troad, or vice versa, by simply following the heavily trafficked maritime highways through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. It was a known, heavily utilized route.
It was the primary artery of the region. As the brief points out, noting this geography does not conclusively prove that a historical Odin traveled that specific route on a specific Tuesday in the Iron Age.
Of course not.
But what it does establish is that a connection between a northern Black Sea lineage and the Troad does not require an impossible magical leap between unrelated worlds. It is an entirely geographically testable proposition grounded in the physical reality of ancient travel.
I have one last major hurdle we need to clear, and it's a big one. It's the standard explanation. Whenever this topic comes up, traditional historians always pull out the exact same argument to dismiss the entire Norse-Trojan connection.
Yes, the medieval fad argument.
They say, look, medieval monks and scholars all over Europe were obsessed with Troy. The Romans claimed Trojan roots through Aeneas. The Franks claimed it through a mythological figure named Francio. The Britons claimed it through Brutus of Troy.
Right, everyone wanted a piece of Troy.
Exactly. It was just a massive medieval intellectual fad. Scandinavian authors like Snorri just wanted to sit at the cool kids' table of European literature, so they invented a Trojan backstory for Odin to legitimize their own pagan past in a Christian framework.
That is the dominant academic explanation, and the Project Troy brief acknowledges that it is a very important observation. The surviving Priam to Odin genealogy in the Prose Edda is unquestionably shaped by medieval learned culture.
The Christian scholars absolutely padded the list.
They added Anglo-Saxon kings to Odin's lineage to harmonize different traditions. They drew from Christian universal histories to link Germanic paganism to classical antiquity. They stylized it to fit the intellectual expectations of their time.
But, and this is a massive but, just because a medieval writer expanded a genealogy or dressed it up in classical Latin style to impress a European audience does not mean they invented the core wooden Troy connection from thin air.
This is the crux of the Project Troy methodology. A medieval construction can still be built around something older. Showing that medieval monks padded the genealogy with recognizable names does not automatically demonstrate that they fabricated the basic foundational idea that Odin's people had roots in the region of Troy.
This is what happens when we stop treating our ancestors like they were simple-minded or purely deceitful. They built upon older truths. Snorri's text is a medieval construction, sure, but what older, shorter, perhaps oral tradition of Trojan or Anatolian descent was he building it around?
It is entirely possible that the entire connection was a 13th century invention. The brief allows for that possibility. But another, much more intriguing possibility must be tested. Medieval scholars may have inherited a much older, shorter, or less specific claim of Trojan ancestry.
Perhaps from the Roman or Hellenistic era, referring to the wider Troad or a population migrating from that connected Black Sea network.
Exactly. When the medieval scholars encountered this raw claim, they expanded it into a complete prestige-laden pedigree, reaching all the way back to Homer's Priam, because Priam was the only reference point they had for Trojan greatness.
It's like someone saying, my grandpa says their family is from the Troad area. A medieval monk hears this and writes down, behold, the direct descendant of King Priam of Bronze Age Troy. They take a localized geographical truth and inflate it into a mythological absolute.
We have to separate the medieval exaggeration from the potential historical kernel. What's fascinating here is that the padding does not invalidate the core claim of an Eastern, Anatolian, or Black Sea origin.
If we pull all of this together, all the geography, the historiography, the analysis of the texts, what's the bottom line here? What is the main takeaway for how we approach this going forward?
Project Troy is demanding a complete reset of the academic conversation. We have to stop asking the fundamentally flawed question, was Snorri right that Odin escaped Troy after the Bronze Age Trojan War? Because that question contains the mistake within it. The genealogy doesn't say that. It never said that.
We have to ask better questions. Does any medieval source explicitly say the migrating Odin personally lived during Priam's war? No. Is the Trojan connection presented as a personal residence or an inherited political identity used to unite disparate tribes?
What did Icelanders actually understand by the name Troy? Could an earlier claim have referred to Roman Ilion, a city that was very much alive and interacting with the Black Sea region?
Until those questions are answered, the standard academic dismissal of Odin's Eastern origins is simply premature. It was based on a misreading of the text and a profound misunderstanding of ancient geography and political propaganda.
It really is.
This has been absolutely staggering. If we go back to that burning city we pictured at the beginning of our deep dive, the flames, the falling walls, the escaping king, we've spent centuries looking at that Bronze Age fire, laughing at the timeline, and missing the real story entirely.
The real story isn't about a man outrunning Greek chariots in 1200 BC. It's about how ancestry, geography, and cultural memory were utilized to build dynasties, unite war bands, and move nations across continents centuries later.
And that leaves us with a lingering, frankly explosive question. If Odin didn't flee the Bronze Age Trojan War, and if Troy continued to thrive as a strategic, highly connected Roman city known as Ilium, it entirely shifts the timeline of the historical Odin. If he was a real leader, using a real geopolitical claim of Trojan descent to unite tribes in the Black Sea region, what later unrecorded empire was he actually fleeing from when he marched his people north? Were they fleeing the Huns? The collapse of Roman authority? We've been looking in the wrong millennium.
It changes the entire paradigm of early Germanic history.
This is only the beginning of the investigation. Head over to woodensman.com for the free official brief and follow @Woodensman on all platforms. And for the full investigation, watch for the book, The Quest for the Historical Odin by researcher Christopher T. Knight, December 1st, 2027.